Hello, it's David Leroy here, and today's slide presentation is on anatomical dolls, and this relates in particular to issues where they are used in forensic interviews. So I'm going to talk about the main idea behind the use of anatomical dolls. I'm also going to present a key piece of research that was conducted by Maggie Bruck and her colleagues in 1995. And I'm going to end by talking a little bit about current thinking, and I have some references to direct you to a couple of more recent reviews on the topic. So, what are anatomical dolls? Well, these are dolls that have anatomical features included in their design. So, boy dolls will have penises, girl dolls will have front privates. The dolls also have all of the other private parts as well. And in forensic interviews, sometimes they're produced and shown to the child in an effort to be able to get the child to disclose suspected sexual or physical abuse. So the dolls originated in clinical settings and were probably initially used by clinical psychologists in their interactions with children where abuse was suspected. And there's a number of different uses that professionals have used the dolls for. They've been used as comforters and icebreakers, so sometimes children will seem a little reluctant to talk, and if you give them a doll, it gives them something familiar that they might be able to hold. They've also been used as anatomical models, and because the dolls have all of the private parts included in their design, they can be used as a model of human bodies that professionals have thought might help children be able to demonstrate alleged abuse. And sometimes the dolls have been considered a useful memory stimulus, so if the child can't quite remember certain aspects of an event or what happened to them, maybe showing them a doll will help trigger some of those memories. The dolls have also been used as screening and diagnostic tests, and this is a situation where a professional might introduce a doll into a forensic interview and just watch the child interact with that doll. And depending on how the child interacts with the doll, they may be able to tell whether or not the child has been abused. So just to pick up on a couple of those points. So what psychologists are interested in more to do with the retrieval aspects and their usefulness in forensic interviews for children to be able to explain what allegedly happened to them. So they can be used as a retrieval cue. This would be related to theories around context reinstatement by Tolving and so forth. Maybe a child can't quite remember, but if we show them the doll, then it will be able to trigger the memories of what they experienced. They're also potentially able to overcome language difficulties. So if children are being required to explain the actions of another grown-up, they might not have words in their vocabulary that are able to accurately portray what happened. And so maybe if children are struggling to find specific words for things that have happened to them, uh, showing them a doll and allowing them to point and demonstrate on a doll might be able to overcome some of those difficulties. And it's also hypothesized that children might be reluctant or shy, embarrassed to actually tell an interviewer intimate details about a particular type of abuse. And so if they're shy or embarrassed to do that, maybe using a doll in a forensic interview will be able to overcome some of that embarrassment. As I said, the dolls have also been used to diagnose sexual abuse. So this is the situation where a professional will just watch the interaction a child has with one of the dolls. They might introduce it into an interview, take off some of the clothes, show the child that it has the private parts and just ask the child to interact with the doll. And this is a cake and have your cake and eat it too sort of situation. So sometimes if children completely avoid the doll and don't want to touch it, that has sometimes been said that there is evidence of abuse because the child doesn't want to even look at the doll when it has its anatomical parts. But it's also diagnostic of abuse, supposedly, if the child actually interacts with the doll. But as you'll see from the research that I'm going to show you in the following slides, children that haven't been abused probably also show these sorts of behaviours. So if nothing actually happened to the child and an anatomical doll is introduced into the interview, well, those children too might avoid using the doll or just innocently interact with the doll. And then adults may actually diagnose that some type of abuse has occurred when it hasn't. So what about a key piece of research? Well, this was conducted by Maggie Bruck and her colleagues in 1995. And a central research question was, are anatomical dolls useful at helping children communicate body touch? And this is an example where psychologists have taken something and put it under the experimental spotlight. And so we can ask questions about how well children are able to use anatomical dolls through conducting experiments. And in this study, the participants were very young children. They were 3 years old, and 40 3-year-olds were recruited into the study. The study was conducted around what's called a well child medical examination. So the study was conducted in a doctor's surgery, and this is the type of examination that parents will take their children to a doctor's surgery every so often for a checkup, just to make sure that everything is going okay for that child. And the well child medical examination, involves, a doctor, doing all sorts of tests with children, measuring their height and weight and so forth. But sometimes the doctor will also have an examination of the child's genital area. And what the researchers did in this study was arrange for half of the children to have that genital examination, and then half of the children didn't receive that as part of their well child examination. So we've got a couple of groups of children. All of them are getting a medical examination, but half of the children are having their genitals examined by the doctor and half aren't. So after the well child medical examination, the children were interviewed straight away about what happened with the doctor. They were interviewed with the assistance of anatomical dolls. So the interviewers sat down with the child, introduced the doll, removed the doll's clothes. The researcher would ask questions directly to the child, and sometimes these questions would be yes/no questions. So the researcher might point to the private part and simply ask the child, "Did the doctor touch you here?" And they would do that for all of the private parts and other parts of the body where the child was touched by the doctor. The researchers also asked the children to demonstrate on the doll where they were touched by the doctor. And also they were just asked to interact with the doll and show the researcher what they remember happened. At the end of the interview, the researchers also showed the child a spoon, and the doctor said, the researcher said, did the doctor do something with the spoon? Show me on the doll. So the child was able to take the spoon, and if they wanted to, use the spoon to interact with the doll. So if the child said that that the doctor didn't do anything with the spoon, they then went on to ask the child to hypothetically show what could have happened with the spoon. And so that's the basic logic behind the experimental design. What were the results? Well, the results were very interesting indeed. Overall, there was a very low accuracy rate in the study. So the children were quite inaccurate, around about 50%. And so that means that in the study, when the dolls were introduced, children were getting details about the interaction with the doctor right half of the time, but they were also getting many of the details wrong as well. So children who were touched, these are the children who did have their genitals examined by the doctor, about half of them were able to accurately show that they had had their genitals touched, but half of them weren't able to do that either. And also, somewhat concerning is that children that did not have their genitals examined by the doctor were falsely claiming that they had been touched there. And these are very forensically relevant findings. And the researchers concluded that this pattern of results provides very, very little support for the use of dolls with 3-year-old children. It's important to remember that the interview itself was a highly suggestive procedure. So it's unusual in real life for interviewers to conduct highly, highly suggestive interviews in this manner. But it does happen, and I suppose the generalizability of these studies would depend upon interviewer practices in particular jurisdictions. What happened with the spoon? So the interviewers gave the children a spoon and asked the child to show what happened with the spoon or what could have happened with the spoon. Almost 20% of children inserted the spoon into the private parts of the dolls. 28% of the children were able to use some of the props to show touching of the privates, and a smaller percentage of the children were aggressive with the dolls when they were given the spoon. So overall, 58% of the children reported some of these behaviors, which were evenly split between children that had been touched and children that had not had their genitals examined or touched by the doctor. Now, there's an issue that's worth exploring in more detail, and I would encourage you to do this. I'm going to make a couple of comments, but it's probably worth reading more widely on the topic of age. So one question that sometimes arises around research, especially in forensic contexts, is, well, does that apply to a children of a particular age? If the study is done on 3-year-olds and in a particular case you have a 5-year-old kid, can we apply the results to that particular case? But I would encourage you to read research by Judy Deloche, who has studied extensively issues to do with representational shift. And this is children's developing ability to be able to use symbols and models and so forth in an accurate way to help them explain their experiences. And there's an article here, Rapid Changes in the Symbolic Functioning of Very Young Children, that should be available somewhere on the internet if you Google it, and I would recommend reading that. It's a very elegant and straightforward study that really does make the point about representational shift very clearly. So another couple of comments about age. So what research shows in the Maggie Bruck study is that the use of dolls is probably going to be very risky with young children. In this study that I just described, children weren't able to really use the dolls with any degree of accuracy. So back to the question of age, yeah, that research was conducted on 3-year-old children. Judy Deloche's research is conducted looking at differences between 2.5 and 3-year-old children. What about older children? Well, there's a sort of a an interesting issue here. The children that we would want to help, that we're going to have the most difficulty communicating, are going to be very young children. And what the research shows is that dolls don't work with very young children. So, is it okay to use them with older children? Well, what we know about children as they develop, they become increasingly more able just to tell you what happened. And so, in forensic interviews, they're not really needed with older children because older children are often perfectly able to explain what happened, providing the interviewer conducts developmentally appropriate and sensitive interviews. And with older children, because they are able to talk and provide narratives, if you introduce a doll and then accompany that with quite closed questioning, it can restrict the communication ability of an older child. So if you introduced a doll into an interview with a 12-year-old, you would start turning the communication style of that 12-year-old into a young child. They'll just be able to answer the yes/no questions being posed by the interviewer. So dolls are also introduced by interviewers that don't have specific training. I began by saying that these dolls were probably originally used in clinical settings, and they would be by people who would be quite highly trained in psychology. But over the years, they've become sort of like an item that is stored in the closets of interview rooms. And so what we have seen over the years is forensic interviewers without any psychology training or knowledge of the risks and benefits that using dolls might pose are able to just reach for the dolls, and if they feel like it, introduce those into a forensic interview. So that can be a little bit of an issue as well. Um, Researchers have also looked at studies or conducted studies of forensic interviews in which dolls have been introduced, and what they've tended to find is that the dolls don't really increase the amount of information substantially that children provide. They're often accompanied by very closed questions, and there are known risks with closed questions as well. So combining those with anatomical dolls can exacerbate communication errors. It's also worth noting that when I have reviewed DVDs of forensic interviews that do have anatomical dolls used at some point, um, it's actually very difficult to see what's going on. So the interviewer can be quite close to the child, and they might undress the doll, and then the child might be pointing to certain parts. But when you're trying to review what's exactly going on, it's very difficult to see very small fingers and quick movements that the child is making, and it's difficult to be sure sometimes exactly where the child's pointing or what the child is doing. And it's also very difficult to synchronize the child's movements with the interviewer's questions. You would want to be really, careful that the interviewer is asking questions and then allowing the child time to be able to demonstrate what happened. But this doesn't always happen. Sometimes the interviewer is asking quite a lot of questions, and the child is making quite a few movements, and then it becomes really difficult to know which behavior or point or action is the answer to particular questions posed by the interviewer. And so it's generally accepted these days that anatomical dolls should not be used as a matter of routine in forensic interviews. There may be some justification in some cases, but you would want to make sure that in those cases people are well trained in the pros and cons of using anatomical dolls, and that other interview procedures and protocols have been exhausted, all right, and so that you're left with no other alternative but to use this anatomical doll to try and find out from a child what's happened to them. So I'm just going to finish the presentation here by orientating you towards a couple of reviews. This one, Forensic Interviewing Aids, Do Props Help Children Answer Questions About Touching, was published by Deborah Paul, Maggie Bruck and Mel Pipe, 2011. You can grab this off the internet if you just Google some of the title. This is a pretty damning article about the use of dolls and props in forensic interviews. So a quote from the article is, "Props elevate the risk of erroneous touch reports." That is not the thing you would want to be finding out in relation to forensic interviews, right? We don't want to be introducing anything into forensic interviews that are going to increase the risk of inaccurate information, let alone increase mistakes about particular body touching. There's also another article here by Deborah Paul and Maggie Bruck. This came out the year after, in 2012. The impact of interviewing props on children's reports of touching, and it's published in a very good journal called Developmental Review. I've got the link here, but again, this is easily Googleable if you Google divining testimony and put Maggie Bruck's name into it. And their conclusion is still pretty glim when it comes to the use of anatomical dolls. And they say available research does not instill confidence that props are the best solution for interviewing challenges. So that's the overview of the use of anatomical dolls, and I would encourage you to read more widely and uncover as many issues as you think are relevant.